Well, hello again. It's Andrew here yet again, and today is episode number 61, and we're looking again at Matthew 14 verses 13 to 21. We had an introductory look at this yesterday as we looked at the background, and today we're going to look at it itself, and I've got a title. Today is You Feed Them. So, Matthew chapter 14 verse 10 to 13. Now when Jesus heard this, that is, that John the Baptist had been executed, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You need to give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, beside women and children. Yesterday we considered the backdrop of the story, as I said, as it's told in Matthew's Gospel. Interesting thing is that if you look at the other Gospels, they have different takes on what the background story, what the backstory is to this particular miracle. But the thing is that, and it's interesting, each Gospel tells its own story, and yet they're all telling the same story. Today we actually consider the miracle, or as John's Gospel puts it, the sign of the feeding of the 5,000 plus. All 4 Gospels include this story. Now this happens less often than we might imagine. And clearly each of the Gospel writers, whether you think they were individuals or teams of people over periods of time, clearly each thought it was an important story. And there's a remarkable consistency in the story itself. It seemed to me that there are no apparent conflicts in what happened. And John adds that the 2 fish and the 5 loaves were provided by a small boy. So what really happened? Well, I don't know. It has been suggested that the generosity of the small boy provoked the generosity of everyone else who brought food, and it should really be called the miracle of the sharing of food, because the example was so strong that everybody brought out the little secret stashes they had and decided to share it with all their neighbours. And lo and behold, there were 12 baskets left over at the very end. It's possible. I want to suggest it's unlikely, because none of them even hint at this at all. All the writers affirm that a significant miracle had occurred. So what are we to make of it? Well, it seems to me, without arguing about what did or didn't happen, we can actually see some things from it that are useful. The first is that Jesus' compassion extends beyond just preaching and healing. His concern that people don't faint on the way home. They've been out all day. Many have come some distance, and I think that's difficult to argue. He's concerned for the whole person, and he's able to meet every need, and not just wants. Meet the basic needs. It was not that long ago we had one of our parishioners that was really struggling to sell her house. And in the end she sold it not long before the whole coronavirus thing blew up, which was very fortuitous. It had been a long journey for her. And I emailed her and said, "I hope you got what you needed." And she wrote back, and she realised immediately what I'd actually said and what I hadn't said. She says, yes, she got what she needed. She didn't get what she wanted, but she got what she needed. And I think that's something we generally can count on, that we're going to get from Jesus what we need. It may not be what we think we want, but we will ultimately get what we need. And I think one of the key issues here is, for me anyway in the story, is that Jesus doesn't expect us to give what we don't have. Jesus doesn't expect us to give what we don't have. We do need to recognise, though, what we do have. One of the stories that is one that I'll often quote, seems to come around in various ways, is in Exodus chapter 4, where God and Moses have this encounter, and Moses objects that he doesn't have anything, any resources to be able to convince the Pharaoh that God has spoken to him. And the Lord asks him this simple question. He says, "What's in your hand?" And Moses has a staff. And so the Lord shows him how he can use his staff to convince the Pharaoh that God has spoken to him. The question is, what's in your hand? And it's the same question for each of us. As I said, I don't believe that God holds us accountable for what we don't have. He doesn't hold us accountable for what he hasn't given us or what he hasn't resourced us or equipped us with. God does hold us accountable for what we do have. And I think one of the mistakes that churches often make is that we look at what we don't have. It took me a long time to twig to this. That I recognised that what I did have was a group of mainly elderly people. And rather than seeing them as a liability, I learnt to see them as the rich and wonderful gift that they are. It's what God had put in my hand. And I think it's true for all of us. We need to see what we have, not what we're lacking, not what we're pining for, not what we think that God is holding out on us on, but what actually we have in our hand. It's one of the reasons why I'm doing this. It's what I have in my hand. It's something that I can do, and I know that not everybody, not every minister, not every pastor can do this. Well, it's something, it seems, that the Lord has equipped me to do. I don't know how long I'll be able to keep doing it for, but this is something I can do. There's a lot of other things that I can't do, but this is one thing I can. So I'm seeking to respond faithfully in terms of what I can do. And the reality is that I'm loving it. I'm enjoying it. It's energizing. It's so easy, isn't it, that when Jesus makes a call on our life to say, "But I have nothing to offer." And Jesus asks us, actually, what do you have? You have 2 fish and 5 loaves. Let's see what we can do with those together. Bring it here to me. And it says, as we offer what we do have, we discover what Jesus can do with it. I never imagined as a young person myself being in this situation. As a 16-year-old, I never thought that I'd ever get married. As I've said a number of times, anxiety is something that has dogged me for a large part of my life. And the whole idea of, as a 16-year-old, of contemplating standing in front of a whole church full of people and saying 2 simple words, "I do," completely freaked me out. And yet, here I am. God can use what we have, and God longs to use what we have and what we're prepared to offer, what we're prepared to give back, and to be able to make a difference, not just in our lives, hopefully it will be in our lives, but also in the lives of those that God puts us among. So I just want to encourage you today to look not at what you don't have, but look at what you do. To look not at what God hasn't given you and look enviously at those about, but look at what God has given you and be willing to offer that and see the possible miracle that might eventuate if you're willing to give it, as the small boy did, back to Jesus. Be at peace.